My name is Kilindi Iyi. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I am by vocation a traditional martial artist. I teach ancient and contemporary African martial sciences, and I explore consciousness through the utilization of high-dose tryptamine hallucinogens.
Welcome. Okay, just a quick question regarding the martial arts. I'm a martial artist myself, fledgling, and I found that the practice of martial arts, more than yoga and any other practices, really grounded me. Because by nature I'm a psychonaut, but the martial arts have somehow really distilled my yin and yang and grounded me, which has then gone on to help me with my psychedelic journeys and ayahuasca ceremonies. So I'm just wondering to what extent do the martial arts and your psychedelic arts fuse? And I also wanted to ask, like, I find myself in practicing martial arts and using cosmic weapons within my journeys, and so I just wanted to ask, how martial arts have helped you with your psychedelic journeys, and do you use martial arts on a kind of astral martial art level in your journeys?
Well, I mean, I do, being in the warrior class, utilize transdimensional martial arts, weapons that are utilized in those particular battles when they do occur. If you look at the history of many of the martial arts, they'll say that they got them in a dream, or that they had some type of epiphany and things came to them, or they were frozen in time and they watched a praying mantis fighting a grasshopper or something like that. In reality, through the translation encoded is the utilization of particular psychedelics, because all traditional ancient martial arts were tied with the particular hallucinogen of their choice, be it Japanese, Chinese, Indonesian, Filipino, American, indigenous people, African. They all had power plants or power fungi that went with the martial arts that not only gave them inspiration to be able to create new techniques, new areas of understanding as far as the martial arts is concerned, but also many of the systems incorporated to augment power with things like bodily energies and healing as part of the martial arts. So you have those type of sensibilities that are part of the whole complete system of martial arts that today some have retained it, but most have given that whole entheogenic part of the martial arts up.
I think that's, this is something that I actually never heard of myself, and I've been interested in martial arts since I was about 15 years old. And it sounds, for me, having just dabbled in, using martial arts and entheogens, it's really, perhaps it's lacking a kind of integral component of the martial arts, as you're saying. And yesterday in the panel discussion, there was a little bit of talk of, fusing our practices such as yoga practice, or martial arts, qigong, with the psychedelics. And because we're working with a holistic system of physicality and energetic bodies, then surely, the holy grail that would meet the physical and the metaphysical within these practices would be the chalice of, the entheogen. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you also about the mycelium, and because you've had some very profound knowledge regarding the mycelium, whether you believe it to be an alien life form, because as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, the mycelium is one of the only, it can survive in space, and it has a kind of seeding, it's a little bit like a spider.
The spores are what survive in space. The mycelium has a particular area of life cycle that's hooked to proper temperature, free running water, having the right media to grow and things like that. So it's not so much the mycelia itself, but the spores that carry the information that create the mycelium that are the entities that have the ability to traverse the vacuum of space. But once the mycelium is in the proper environment and it germinates and then moves from monokaryotic mycelium, which is the one set of genes, to dikaryotic mycelium, the double genes, then it can move to the fruiting stage. But it is basically like brain tissue, a neural network. It patterns and parents these networks into different levels of informational structures. In other words, you'll see the same type of structure that is mycelial under the ground that connects not only itself but also to the plant kingdom and things like that. You'll see the same kind of patterns in space, in galaxies and things like that, solar systems that from a distance look the same as mycelial neural networks.
Mycelium is the biggest life form on the planet, correct?
Yeah, well,
Living organism.
the largest organism outside of the Earth itself, being a living organism. There's actually two areas. One is in Washington. They have a large mycelial mat, and then there's one in Michigan. And since I'm from Michigan, I say the largest one in the world is from Michigan, and the people in Oregon say the largest one in the world is in Oregon. But it's between the two.
Okay.
Mycelial mats that have the largest area of coverage that is actually one entity.
And you seem to have an incredibly profound and special relationship to the mushroom. You're a smart guy, and so I wanted to ask you, why did you choose the mushroom amongst all the other entheogens?
Well, in my opinion, and what is shown to me in observation of all the other entheogens, is that the mushroom, the fungal kingdom is older than the plant kingdom. It's 465 million years older than the plant kingdom, so the fungal kingdom has a greater plenum of information as far as longevity on the planet. It precedes the deserts that created cacti. It precedes the different plant kingdoms that would have standalone entheogenic plants, that you could just ingest and get the experience from. So it's older. It's kind of like I pair it off with LSD. LSD, of course, is a wonderful compound. It's very useful and things like that, but it doesn't have the same density of information that mushrooms have because of its inception in the 1930s, as opposed to the mushrooms. We really don't know how old the informational structure is because it goes beyond this planet.
Because you actually referred to the mushrooms yesterday as a living library.
Yeah, definitely.
Entwined with the Akashic Records.
Yes, a mnemonic device also. It jars memory, cellular memory, genetic DNA memory from not only our remote past but also our future, what we're moving into, because they talked about yesterday, we were talking about receptors for particular chemical compounds that we haven't even encountered yet, that we will encounter in the future, that we have the receptors for.
Or that are not native to this planet.
They're not native, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. That was really fascinating.
Can I ask a question about your personal opinion of Soma? Now, Soma is the ancient Indian entheogen that no one knows exactly what it is, and some say that it's a lost plant entheogen that is forever lost. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, nothing's forever lost because information is, it's kind of like Earth, Wind, and Fire says about sound or music, that sound never dissipates, it just creates in another time and place. The Soma, if you look through the literature, there are approximately 108 different Soma plants that come from different sources. 7 are mushrooms, and 100 are plants, and 1 is what they call somaraja, which is the rue, or the wild rue, Syrian rue. The oldest soma plant, I believe, is the blue psilocybin mushroom. That being, Gordon Watson said it was the Amanita muscaria mushroom, but it doesn't have the relationship to even the deities of the ancient Vedic knowledge and information. You know, Krishna's blue, there's cow culture, the cows are revered. And of course the mushrooms come from the cow dung, you know. So if we look at Vishnu and Shiva and others, you know, their blue color is the same blue color as the mushrooms. And since you're dealing with a cow reverence culture, you have correlations in what they would have available and what they would be able to use, and what they would be able to have available and use at a very early period, before they would encounter later on alchemies that would allow other hallucinogens to work. I mean, it's just like I talk about ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is, of course, again, another wonderful compound, but it's an alchemy, so it's very recent in its relationship to the human being, you know, because at the time that we're going to build ayahuasca, number one, you had to have to domesticate a fire. You would have to have vessels that you made to be able to hold and contain the water. You have to dig. Number three, get the particular plants and isolate them to bring them together, and then you'd have to deal with the technology of grinding, boiling, driving the excess water down and things like that to create something. So it's an alchemy, it's older. Whereas the mushroom, if you have cows in your vicinity and you have the proper environment, you're going to see the mushrooms. And even back as far as hunters and gatherers, even back as far as ancient hunters and gatherers, if you're gathering food stuff for food, and you see mushrooms in nature, and mushrooms in nature can be quite prolific, and they can be quite available as far as sight is concerned. You have one that may be the size, maybe 8 inches tall with a saucer-like cap on the top and things like that. So it's going to be visually available, and people who are looking for food are going to try it. And once they try it, they're going to find out that it has different levels of ingestion. As far as if you eat a bunch of them, things get really weird. If you eat a little bit of them, it's going to be an adaptive advantage for your hunting and gathering, because it's going to make you see better. It's going to sharpen edges. Colors are going to be more vivid. So things that you would want to find, or that you were looking for, that is food, say a potato with a yellow flower, or some tuber with a yellow flower. If you can see that tuber at 100 yards when you eat psilocybin, as opposed to 50 yards when you don't eat psilocybin, that's an adaptive advantage for finding food. It means you're going to have more available food, which is going to be better for growing children and them being raised to the age of majority where they can have children, and then the genes will be passed on to the next generation. So that's an adaptive advantage. Psilocybin, I say, is the oldest because the fungal kingdom is older. The plenum of information is denser because it's been there, and we encountered it earlier than we encountered the other things that we look at as the natural psychedelics.
Touching back on fungal sporulation, my background is actually microbiology and genetics, so I'm very interested in the origins of life. And there's 2 schools of thought: that it came about on Earth through random collisions of molecules which eventually sprung up into organisms, and another one where life came from space and propagated on Earth. And that is the school of thought that I personally agree more with. What are your opinions?
Well, I agree with the space area of information dealing with that, because we looked at we talked about the Drake equation on how many habitable planets for life there are in the galaxy, and the numbers are off the charts. Literally billions of habitable planets that are no different than this one, and in some places in better positions than this one, where life could be just as easily as it is here. So with that amount of density of habitable places that life could be, they don't have to be walking around with 2 legs, 2 arms, and heads, or horses, or anything like that. But basic one-cell organisms, fungi, those type of things should be prolific throughout the galaxy. And with things like supernovas and things like that, spores are one of the densest things in nature, and they have the ability, especially in the vacuum of space, to be particularly almost what you would say immortal. So even a star exploding, these spores could possibly survive that in larger chunks of rocks and things like that, which they could be embedded, or they could be encased in rocks. And when the particles go out into space, it's kind of like the panspermia type thing, that these spores can survive in space. So I tend to agree with the theory that it came from the outer realms, outer space, and things like that.
Yesterday, during the panel, I was asked, you said that this reality, you believe it to be a simulation.
Yes.
Yes. So if it is a simulation, who's running it behind the curtain, so to speak? And is there any way you touched a few times on the Vedas or the Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism? Who's running the show, and is there any stories within the Vedas that weave perfectly into this viewpoint that you have about reality being a simulation?
Well, I mean, you'd have to stretch the creation stories into that.
As we always have
don't
to.
know. Yeah, we don't know. I mean, nobody knows who's running it. Nobody knows who's running it. It could be a 15-year-old in the future who's, high school science project is to create a simulated universe, and there's a possibility we could be in that. I don't think so, but those are one of the possibilities that the creator could be, like I said, a 15-year-old in the future who has working on his class high school science project. No different than Super Mario, the game. The creator of Super Mario, Super Mario becomes sentient inside of the game through just the AI algorithms inside of the game. Kind of like those life games that you start the game off and then it randomly starts to making things and doing things and stuff like that, and eventually Super Mario becomes sentient. Now he finds out that there is a creator. He doesn't know who the creator is. He's trying to contact the creator, but the creator doesn't really have a lot of, he's not worried about Super Mario because he's playing the game. He can turn it off, turn it back on, reprogram it, change the physics inside of it. So we don't know who the ultimate originator of this is. My conclusion, just from a personal level, is that ultimately, since we are consciousness, and consciousness creates the reality as we exist inside of it, that we're ultimately our own pushers of this whole thing. I don't believe that we have a beginning origin. It's kind of like it's said in the, we're talking about the Vedic and things like that, and we're talking about the Mahabharata and talking about the Bhagavad Gita inside of the Mahabharata. We're talking about that there's never been a time when you did not exist, and there'll never be a time when you cease to exist. So that there's no time that you come into existence. You've always existed, and I know that's kind of a hard thought process, but I believe that ultimately we are the originators of our situation that we exist in as far as what we call life through consciousness.
So, if it is a simulation, and you use the terminology again, do you not think that for some people it would give them an excuse for them not to really execute any responsibility on the planet if it's all simulation? It's kind of like this spiritual bypassing that we often see within spiritual communities, that reality is an illusion, and therefore there's no kind of honorability in the path that is walked.
Yeah, well, that's all a personal responsibility sidebar of the whole thing. Even though what they say is true, that doesn't give up your personal responsibility to deal with life from a certain vantage point. It's kind of like if we go back to Super Mario. People say that they pray to God for God to recognize them and do this and that. But if God's a 15-year-old and he created Super Mario, does he care about Super Mario? Does he care about the creature that he created in the computer? Probably not, because it's just a simulation to him. So even though I say when my sojourns are not for the earth, they're not to save the whales or the rainforest and those type of things, I still have a personal responsibility, since I'm in it, to deal with saving the whales and saving the rainforest and things like that. But ultimately, still, it's an illusion. So it's a personal choice inside of a person who's on some type of spiritual path to be able to discern that you still have to participate in the reality that you exist in. You can't just retreat from it and say that nothing makes any difference, because ultimately nothing makes any difference, but ultimately everything makes a difference.
Absolutely, we're always
and that goes back into
paradox.
Those go back into those dichotomies and paradoxes and all that kind of stuff. Everything's an illusion, but you still have to participate in the illusion.
I think
yeah.
Albert Einstein says reality is an illusion, albeit a very persistent one.
Yeah, very persistent.
And especially if we are, I believe that we are the co-creators. It's a symbiotic process.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you: are there any kind of higher intelligences apart from yourself and the Mycelium that you invoke or work with from any perhaps like religious, spiritual path?
Oh, well, I mean, there are higher intelligences that I encounter and that I acknowledge. I don't work with any higher intelligences as far as, I don't look at anything as higher than myself. We're all co-equal inside of the reality that we exist in, the multiverse.
That's a rare conviction.
Yeah,
I really honor that.
And that comes from doing the high doses and seeing myself from a different vantage point. If I looked at myself just as the human and what I am, then I say, oh, well, these things are so much greater than I am and things like that. But from the vantage point of my higher self, which is generating myself here, and I'm uploading into that higher self information from this vantage point, I've existed in who I truly am. So in that from that vantage point, I don't see anything as higher than me. No God, no entity, or anything like that exists anywhere in space, time, or beyond that is higher or more powerful than I am.
I like that. In Buddhism, we have something called the divine. We cultivate divine pride and divine appearance, which is often a concept of pride as something that's, it's given a bit of a negative viewpoint from the spiritual community, where we have this this idealism of killing the ego. That, for example, for me, as far as I've looked into the Vedas, it says if you didn't have your ego, then you wouldn't have anything to identify within your body, within yourself, and you wouldn't be able to exist. You would die. So it's really about aligning our ego with the monadic ego, the super ego. But yeah, I think the word ego, just like the word karma, is it's kind of like a cannonball. It's so loaded because it's so misconstrued and it's often misused. I wanted to ask you about whether you prefer to work within the dark or light, and what I mean is when you take your entheogens, your mushrooms, whether you work in the darkness with the lights off, candles off, or whether you work within the sun, so perhaps you can absorb photonic data. What is your preference and why?
Oh, I mean, I work in all of the areas. I've done sun, I've done out in nature with the trees or the ocean or different places, but the true work I do in darkness alone and in silence for the high dose work. There may be a time when I'll take 5 grams and just go out and sit next to the trees and things like that and do that whole thing. But as I said, when I'm going in and going deep, it's in darkness and without stimuli, without any stimuli, no music, no Beethoven, no candles and crystals or any of that. Just naked in the dark.
Thank you.
So I give a talk on Sunday about consciousness reality and carving your own reality tunnel. How important do you think it is to stick rigidly to a particular paradigm, a particular reality tunnel, or do you think you should keep open-minded enough to alter that and go with the flow and incorporate new material constantly and keep growing?
Well, definitely keep open and keep growing, because each layer of the onion that we peel away, opens up new vistas. I thought when I had taken 35 dry grams several times, I thought, well, I'm pretty much hitting, the ceiling on things, because of the experiences. But, and you get to points of arrogance, I got this and, and all that kind of stuff. But when I took 40 grams, then I got my socks got knocked off and I got dropped to the ground and had to reevaluate that this thing doesn't have a bottom to it. I have to figure out how to get enough in to totally saturate and have access to everything. So it's definitely keeping an open mind and being able to grow in this thing, because at each new level that I get, it just opens up more levels, The rabbit hole, no matter how deep you get down in the rabbit hole, it's more. And that's why my talk on the below the plank length, because scientists, theoretical physicists say that the smallest distance that we can, have in relationship to a meter is 10 to the 35 Planck length. You can't divide after that. And I'm saying, well, if you have a something, you can always divide it. I just, that was just, I'm thinking, well, no matter how small it gets, you can still divide it. And they're saying, well, this is as far as it goes. But that's as far as your mathematics can postulate is the 10 to the 35. And when I believe in my experience that I was below the Planck length, that was just the beginning, not the end. Every time we think something is the end, we've gone as far as we can go. There's always further that we can go, because there's no end to it.
I wanted to ask you a question, and forgive the basicness of it. I wanted to ask in regards to the simulation, and I briefly asked earlier, who's behind the emerald curtain, so to speak. Do you feel that it's benevolent, or is it, for example, like if we're going into the Abrahamical traditions versus the Gnostics would believe that the serpent is the liberator, I mean, I know that we're trying to intertwine something that's, vast into an arena of quite ancient and quite dogmatic schools of thought, but because many of us running with that dogma still today, whether we're conscious of it or not, I'm just wondering, and because we operate on a dualistic level of trying to discern benevolence from perhaps, entropic intent. For example, many people feel that this planet is under quarantine. We touched on the archons yesterday also. Could you possibly allude to what you've perceived?
Well, as far as the planet being on quarantine, it's not quarantine past 20 grams of mushrooms. You can get off and get in there any way you want. If you just reduce it to physically flying out into space, then that's one thing. Quarantined as far as our ability to be able to get off physically at this point in time, which we see that the technology that we're developing will breach that at some point, in the very near future. But as far as being quarantined, you can get off of here and get out at any point in time.
When you still come back into your body, even though you might have downloaded some epic insights and upgraded, on a perhaps DNA and cellular memory, you still come back into a realm of consciousness, stratosphere that is still subject to very dense kind of natural
rigid
laws.
Physics, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so you're still
physics,
subject to that. So I think that's what they, insinuate by being under quarantine. So we still have to come back to that.
Well, I mean,
why do we have amnesia? Why do we have this collective amnesia? Why do we only use a small percentage of our, beautiful brains?
We're only talking from a personal level. If we look at even just the length of time that this planet is they say, been in existence for 4 billion years, but how long have we been supposedly human? For a couple of million years. So the couple of million years that the consciousness has been human is like the blink of an eye. If we're talking about individually, we're talking one thing. If we're talking about as far as a group, we're talking something else. And if we're talking individually as far as being able to have access, we're talking something altogether different again. So in more than the twinkling of an eye, we've went, even in the last 100 years, if you look at the Model T as opposed to a Tesla, that's a big gap. If you look at, when I was a child, I always looked at movies, and I always hated when somebody made a phone call because you always had to wait like 15 minutes when you dial and it goes. And now you have push-button phones. This thing is moving exponentially, and before we know it, it'll be on top of us that those particular things that are looked at that retard us will be just memories, just like now. You children now, they look at those old phones. I think on YouTube they had a thing, and they put the old phone in front of the children who are like 10 and 12 and things like that, and they're like, what is this thing? What, how do you use it? What is it? You give them a LP, and they're like, man, y'all must have had big CD players back then, and now, the CD and the DVD is becoming obsolete because you're just dealing with downloads, and then ultimately you'll deal with virtual reality, you'll deal with access, immediate access with invasive technology that, you answer your phone by just saying, Siri, answer so-and-so's call, or don't take such and such call without having the external hardware. So we're moving to a point to where in the physical realm that we're going to breach the physics and physical realm that we're existing in, and that's in a very short time, because moving exponentially, it becomes quicker and quicker and more magnitude over a shorter period of time. Just like if you look at computers, you have more computing power in your phone than all of the computing power that was probably in the United States in 1968.
But do you not feel that in some respect we're giving over, the virtue of our evolution over to machines, and therefore this is also dumbing us down to a degree because we're not Yeah, we're building machines to kind of do our work. And
Well, yeah, but ultimately you're going to merge with the machine.
well, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel about transhumanism?
Well, transhumanism, if you don't want to be obsolete, is one of the ways that you're going to go. I'm looking at. I had a lecture
You already
called
set up.
the organic singularity as opposed to the technological singularity,
Okay, what's
and I
the
believe that
difference?
they will ultimately merge.
Okay.
That technology, entheogens, our whole existence will not only merge with the technology that we're creating, because it's a self-reinforcing loop of information that the artificial technology that created the organic technology is rolling into the artificial technology again. So we think that the organic is natural and things like that, but it's just another area of the artificial intelligence that is dealing with those infraparticle intelligences that are, again, artificial intelligences that created the simulation that we're in. Simulations embedded in simulation.
But you said that. Now I'm kind of, which came first, the synthetic
The chicken
or
or
the
the
organic?
egg?
Yeah, absolutely, or that old one. So
Well, when you're in the
surely
simulation, you don't know, because you can't really tell when anything. Nobody knows when anything started.
But the synthetic has to be created in order for it to operate, no?
Well,
I mean, maybe that's a very kind of nascent way of looking at it.
Well, you have super technology, super AIs that you see on high dose hallucinogens. You see that technology. You see those supercomputers, super technologies that can generate organic technologies with very little processing power of what they have. You have magical technologies that can create anything. That's what part of what my talk was, dealing with the infraparticle intelligences. They've miniaturized down under the Planck length, and that's where the servers are that generate this reality.
Thank you. Josh?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you both
Very,
for
very much.
having me and interviewing me.
Such a blessing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kilindi.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, what is your name? Can you tell me a little bit of your background?